So as you can hear, I am not from here. I'm from a very, very small town in South Carolina. I grew up like without a lot of music in general around, mainly marching bands and brass bands and various types of very high volume musical activities, where if you were at the concert last night, I do things at high volumes, and I think that goes deep and is not just about loudness, but gets into the issues of presence and everything. So yeah, my whole inroad into everything was via instrumental performance. I studied for 6 years, first at Northwestern and second at the San Francisco Conservatory. Like I said, I kind of come into making my own work via the back door of being a performer and commissioning work and improvising, and got into electronics through that. Was basically like an interested undergrad and be like, I want to figure out how to put like an octave pedal on my trombone, or like I want to figure out like what this stuff was. So I started with yeah, got a mixer, got a couple pedals, and then from there kind of just figured out what EQ was and what all these kind of things were. And then eventually, at a certain point, once I left school, which was about almost 4 years ago now, decided to, it was kind of hovering over my head of like, oh, I should like learn how to code, I should learn how to be able to just make very practical things. I wasn't like, oh, I want to like dream up this new synthesis algorithm that nobody's heard of. It was like, I need a thing that will play white noise there and play a video there and then maybe like scrub through a sample at some point. It's like that, it was super practical, really bare bones kind of stuff. But it kind of scratched an itch in my brain of like being able to just like network a lot of things together. I was really interested in like the kind of expanded sonic potentials of brass instruments, which I'll again come back to later. And like working with composers on yeah, like both finding new sounds, but also finding new ways of notating sound, finding new ways of kind of transmitting sound. And so like this kind of act of what is sonic material and how is it disseminated, whether that's through notation or through diffusion or through coding or through encoding, decoding, everything like that, is something that I still am pretty preoccupied by. So naturally, dealing with code and dealing with digital sound and acoustics in a kind of numerical environment was very appealing, because then, especially dealing in Max MSP, everything is numbers. Every single, like anything can be anything else. And kind of having that premise be illuminated has opened up a lot of things for me. So I'll kind of talk through a couple of things that I've done with Max. Again, I apologize for any messy coding or messy anything. I'm similar to John in that I like to make things work and I like to figure out what they are and then go back through and try to make them stable. So these are all stable, but I'll kind of give just a brief couple of excerpts from a couple pieces. But a big thing that I've been really interested in with that I'll get to concerning the piece last night called Chime Array is finding a way for code to be what I call porous, or like playing an instrument is like, for me, is like this huge interconnected system of modules which can be modulated or have things variously enacted upon them at any given time. So it's, for instance, like on an instrument, like it's not just I play a note, it's like I take a breath, my throat is at a certain tension, my lips are in a certain tension, my mouth is in a certain shape, the instrument has its own resonant properties, and all of those aligning together makes a pure tone. Now you can take any part of that and like make it not resonate with the instrument, or make it have chaotic activity, or have periodic activity, and do all of this at any given stage of that process. You can move things around. That's a lot how I see, kind of now in retrospect, that's how I see instruments. Like they are this big modular environment that's just all in your body. And so the immediacy and the kind of the ability for all of the parameters to kind of be under one big controller, which is you, is something that is very intuitive to me. It's like that's the fundamental state in which I'm interacting with an instrument. And so naturally it got to the point in which my actual coding chops got to be proficient enough that the kind of, I'm going to set this generative thing going, or I'm going to have these things that turn on and off, or having these kind of quasi-random but still very digital or binary things became. I was still interested in a lot of those sounds, but from like kind of philosophical point, those kind of stopped being enough. I wanted to see if code could bend, if it could like really kind of be in flux with its environment. Like, so using stuff like real-time descriptors, a lot of generative things that are not just algorithmic, but kind of reactive to situations and environments and things like that. So for instance, in the chimes piece, which I'll get to in a minute, I've gotten really interested in the idea of like, there's no arbitrary data. Like, all data has its kind of foundations in something else. And so it's creating feedback and creating kind of non-linearities, but through media and through these different kind of things. So I'll kind of just step through a couple of pieces in order of when I did them, so you can actually see the atrocities of my coding in real time. So the first is a piece called Bent. I basically wanted to create a digital trash fire of everything that I could download. This is from a band that I play in called Ensemble Pamplemousse. It's a composer-performer collective. We all write and play for each other. But I joined easily 12 to 13 years after they started. And so they had a whole history on the internet before I even joined. And I wanted to do something with that. I wanted to basically, what if this whole thing was just constantly regurgitating into itself, and this kind of feeling of being overwhelmed. This is the millennial in me speaking, is that being both enticed by and overwhelmed by the glut of information that is out there on the internet that is buzzing around us right now that we can't see. And so to kind of capture this ecstatic feeling of that, but have it be about these people that I know, but about parts of them that I was not around for. So I'll play about like 2 or 3 minutes from this. Basically the setup is that it's flute, like amplified process flute, cello, a sampler, drum set, and then myself doing live electronics and live video. So none of the all this glitch data moshing stuff I had to do all that not in post, but in post and then manipulate the videos. But then doing all the slicing and chopping and all this stuff is being done in real time. But this is kind of like a for internet version of this. And I should add before I do this that every single bit of this material, whether audio, video, samples, anything, is all stuff that I basically ripped from the internet. There is no synthesis, there is no, again, the kind of going back to there's no random data. It is all somehow conceptually knotted in on itself. So you get a bit of an idea about that. Basically, a little bit about the patch for that, this is an updated version of this. So this is not the actual patch that I performed with, but is a newer version that I made. Basically, the whole thing was to have this big, kind of what the previous talk was about, was like this whole recycling thing. So there's nothing, I was trying not to add anything. So it's basically, you have like just series, another explanation is that I usually, for all these pieces, will do like make up some kind of controller environment in Mira, and so I can basically do this all in real time. That was a big thing that kind of unlocked playing these patches in a certain way. So I wasn't using pre-built MIDI controllers. It was like I needed to get all of my fingers on it in a certain way. So you basically can step through a bunch of cues and then have gain controls and kind of speed controls for different buffers of samples, whether they're from like what I'm calling alias tones, or I basically took whatever the microcontroller clock, like it's like 4 million hertz, and then just downsampled it basically, just to get all these really nice pitches. MIDI or any kind of synthetic versions of text, HTML text, MIDI instruments of the group, anything in there, noises of machinery and computers and EMI interface, EMI sounds and all sorts of that, and then all of the previous, I did this for another group called Wild Up, but it would have been, be labeled differently, other patch, and it's basically, yeah, every single piece of music that they've played, I just chopped up and put in this one big buffer, and then I could scrub and kind of go through that. All of the played material they were doing that was like live was all from their own pieces, and so even that level is fed back into itself in that way. And yeah, I mean, the kind of porousness of this was just like more in the kind of digital representations of things, less so on the coding end, but more so on the conceptual end. But again, this was actually not this one patch, but this was the first thing I ever did in Max, is that I started doing it in like 2016, and I was like, I want to make a piece that does this, and I had no idea how to do it, and then I just kind of like hacked my way through it. This was not the patch that I used. It looked a lot worse than this, but yeah, so that was basically kind of my first inroad into this, was just like, oh, I really am interested in how how code can be used to kind of refigure the ways in which we see the world, and using expectation and reality, and kind of using code to jam itself into reality and figure out other ways of seeing it in that way. Kind of following that has been, again, sorry, this is a bit scattered, but again, following that is kind of an instrument that Alex mentioned that I was playing last night that I've been working on off and on for the past couple of years, which is I needed to figure out a way to just be able to bring both my work with modular synths and also work with Max encoding into a like freely improvised environment. I have tried for years to do the like trombone plus pedals plus something thing, and it just never felt right, because I either want to muck around in this and get really deep into this, or I really wanted, I was like, oh, I'm going to play one sound and then mess around on my pedals and forever, and that never felt, the two weren't integrated enough to actually be able to make meaningful creative decisions on the spot. And my biggest thing with working with synths was that I've used them a lot as a studio instrument, I've used them as a performance environment in and of themselves, but they don't turn on a dime very easily. And if you're playing in a freely improvised context, which I mostly do now, you have to be able to shift your entire language, you have to be able to shift your entire role, both kind of lowercase p politically, what's your relationship with the people you're playing with and the sounds that you're making. That has to just be able to, like, you have to go. And so I then was like, I really want to find a way, kind of in the lineage of people like, I mean, going all the way back to like Richard Titelbaum, but also like Sam Pluta and other people like that, try to find a way to not have to have an instrument, a physical instrument on stage. And so this is kind of where I'm at now, which is basically a digitally controlled analog synth, which is basically mapped like a wind instrument, where this is like the interface that I'm using to play it. We have this big pad right here, which sends all of the data out over here to my analog synth. And it's basically like, in short, like a no input mixer that you can control the amount of nonlinearity. So it's just 3 oscillators that can circularly FM themselves, plus some basic amplitude modulation and wave folding. But I found that that was the simplest thing that I could have in order to generate a level of kind of gestural control that I really liked. The thing that I was kind of interested in this recently was finding ways for anything to modulate anything else, where it wasn't just a series of voices that you could then put into a series of effects chains, but things such as this little function right here, or this stuff up here. This is basically a way in which I can frequency modulate the control signals to the analog synth according to whatever. I don't have a little UI for it because it's all packed up in here, but I basically have a whole monome grid that's a 3-dimensional cube that I can route any signal to any other destination in real time. So say if I want an external microphone that's on a saxophone to be able to then frequency modulate however many oscillators of my synth, I can do that. And then the next moment I can switch the whole thing around and have it be sent through a whole effects line, and then vice versa. So the kind of malleability of this is less so in the kind of sound synthesis, where I do have a big bank of effects. Each of these can be dumped or reloaded or changed in real time, as well as basically 4 kind of granular tape machines. I learned a lot of this by actually, as you can see here, Rodrigo's work has really helped me, especially as a freelance artist, and how he puts I've learned a lot from unpacking what his patches do. But basically, yeah, the kind of malleability in this is as a routing environment. So it's less so much how does the code itself bend, but more how can all of these modules change their architecture in real time. And so this, I don't have enough time to fully demo this, and I would have to set up a whole modular rig. But those concerns of architecture and reimagining how the architecture can be kind of rewired in real time has kind of led me to the piece that I presented last night. Again, this I wrote for and with Pamplemousse this past fall. The basic premise is that you have, or the basic kind of technical premise is that you have 3 sets of wind chimes that are all hooked up to be, each of the individual rods is itself a capacitive sensor, and basically wanted to find a way to make a piece that you could not learn how to play it except in real time. And so originally it was going to be just a bunch of metal rods or some kind of thing, because I'm interested in these kind of chaotic, more or less chaotic synthesis environments. Definitely much in the kind of lineage of David Tudor, where I learned how to play an instrument very well, and I learned that kind of linear communication. So I feel like a lot of my interest in electronics and things like that have come from not always A doesn't always equal A. And that's something that I find to be really interesting, because I have a thing that A does equal A. And so then to kind of have other environments to kind of scratch those other itches. And so basically, yeah, it just started from the premise of trying to make a piece that you had to relearn how to play it every single time you fired the patch up, and not just do it in these random values reset, but in something that was a little more meaningful. And so from there, went from being I'm going to have all these metallic objects to then, I'm going to have all these metallic hanging rods, and then it's these are just wind chimes, and then kind of pulling back in a lot of this was kind of one of the first steps for me in pulling back a lot of my upbringing, not in urban. I've been living in urban areas for 10 years, and I very much did not grow up in them. And these kind of symbols of nature, or the rural, or things like that, and how we our relationship to them, and how we use sound and music to refer to these kind of things I've gotten really interested in. So I use this piece a lot to kind of to explore these. And so yeah, the basic technical thing is that these capacitive sensors that then can be read in a bunch of different ways. And I'll play a couple excerpts from it because I'm not sure that, how many of y'all were there last night? Okay, I'll play a little bit for context now. So basically, like a couple of examples in there of this kind of more or less data recycling thing that I was really interested in this, and these are things that are not whatsoever like audible, like or in any way. They're all like super internal to this thing. This is more kind of just exploring this on like the kind of philosophical end of the coding, because I could just have a bunch of pseudo-random things going on and it would probably look roughly the same, but like I've got it in my brain where I really care about the actual like stages of how something is made. Like that really, I mean, in the case of this piece, like if I hadn't have really dug deep into that, like this entire thing and now this kind of unspooling of, this is now like the first in a bunch of different pieces that are kind of exploring this, really would not have happened. And so I've started to really get myopically preoccupied with how the actual sound is being made, even down to like the absolute like super granular like micro sound level of like, okay, how does this sound exist? How does it move? How does it behave? What's its kind of molecular structure in a certain way? So then applying that to things like control data, for instance, like the first part of that you saw in the excerpt, sorry, did you have a question? Oh, okay. Like the chimes are basically controlling a set of gates where you can let any amount of the signal through, which just opens up channels in this big feedback network. The lights and the video are actual audio or visual representations of the audio domain, and then basically the DMX lights are being read as single pixels from the video display, and so you get this whole kind of like massive tangle, but it's all one thing, but it's all these different displays of them. A bit about the actual audio feedback network is that when I say it's nonlinear, I tried to make a feedback network that not only do I not know what's going on each second in time, but actually the architecture of it is changing in real time according to, I basically tried to make feedback on every single level of the entire thing to the point in which it's not like an AI type thing, but I literally have no idea what my computer is doing. But we actually have control over, through these capacitive sensors, like the more that you touch them, the more it solidifies. And so it's kind of this unbridled chaos that is just constantly regurgitating itself. And then the more that you touch it, the more it clamps down on it, basically. And I could go into the philosophies of that and how it relates, but that's probably a whole other thing. But some of the fun things technically is that I used, let me find this. So if I'm trying to make a feedback system that is feeding back on every single level, I basically used a Rungling circuit, which is a kind of invention by the Dutch synth maker Rob Hordijk, where you have two oscillators, one of which is feeding data and one of which is a clock, and then you're feeding it into a shift register, which is storing the last 8 bits of data, and then that data can be put back into the original oscillators. And so you have it on there having this kind of what he calls like a chaotic stepped wave generator on the actual sample level. These are then sent out as signals and fed back into each other as audio signals between there's two of these. So you have kind of these two things that are braided together on this level, and they themselves are braided together. And so you have both an audio feedback realm and a data feedback realm, which uses like these basic things. Let me find where the actual core of this is. Yeah. So this is using some of Alex's work with basically like audio descriptors, is that each side of the feedback array is analyzed according to pitch, amplitude, spectral energy, centroid, roughness, and spread, and those things are then fed back into the other one as control data. So it's basically trying to analyze all these different parameters of what the sound is, and then basically normalizing it down to 0 to 1, and then spitting it back in. And so then it's trying to listen to itself. And how that is then listening to itself is basically a Markov generator that's trained on the bit representation of a single sample of one of the wind chimes. And so it's a whole mess. I just basically went down a whole rabbit hole of how can literally the entire architecture of this thing be completely out of my hands, and that we're mainly just trying to navigate this environment. And again, none of this needs to be. I didn't want any of this to be communicated, but I found it to be a fun exercise in how can I really make this thing, even up to literally the architecture level, not be arbitrary in a certain way. Even though training 32 Markov chains on zeros and ones from a bit representation of a single sample is basically pseudo-random ones and zeros, it was still a fun activity to see if I could do it. Yeah, so that's kind of the basic thing for that. And then in the second part, we get into all of these things. I'm not even going to try to find this. Basically, yeah, there's samples of chimes, and there are pitch trackers which track over given windows of how the things are touched. There are the actual green content of all of the video is then controlling how much each of the videos are chroma keyed into each other. The light content is being read as the actual key. Everything is being chroma keyed. It's just it's all this. But that was the thing that was really interesting, is that how can you build these kind of modules that will, if this thing changes, this other thing changes, and then that will cause this other thing to, and it's this environment and this kind of ecosystem that moves like that. So I guess thus far, are there any questions? Because I'm about to take another hard right turn. Yep.
Do you have any camera input for to do the video feedback?
No, it's all pre-recorded video. Because at least in this piece, I was. You mean in the first piece? The glitchy thing.
Yeah.
No, I haven't played too much around with live video stuff, mainly due to both quality and latency, because I am institutionally unaffiliated, and therefore everything that I have to do, I either have to buy or borrow, and I've never had nice enough access to a nice enough camera or a nice enough system to be able to like do video. I mean, I'm pushing the limits of my like 2011 MacBook Pro. Enough as it is without doing live video stuff. It's certainly something I would love to try to do. I've never had the resources to be able to do it. Yep.
You might come to this. Apologies if I'm preempting you.
Yeah.
When you've got something this entangled
Yeah.
and basically complex beyond the point of being able to really steer it.
Yep.
Do you have, as part of your working method, sort of tactics that help you deal with what happens if you don't like what it's doing, like backtracking or steering?
Well, that was the thing is that I kind of lucked out with that. It's a gradual process. I don't set up with like, I'm going to do this. It's like, okay, I'm going to get this working on this level, and then, okay, what's this what is this missing? What does this need? Then kind of, at least in this process, then like I liked the actual like sound of these pendulins and these kind of synthesis things, and then I was like, I tried all these different routings for like, how do I like these audio things feeding into one another? And then it was like, okay, this needs an extra thing. Let me do this, and then tweak that. So it's not completely and utterly out. It's not infinite, but it is like, for this, it was kind of just a nesting thing of like, I made sure to get the bass, because I care a lot about how things sound and the surface of things, and is this just flat compelling, like, and things like that. So at least in this case, and a lot with other compositional stuff, it's in this kind of nesting thing of like, okay, do like the sounds themselves have enough of that kind of energy to it, and then how can I shape that, and then how can I shape that again? And it's this kind of, if it's simple sounds, it's additive, and if it's complex sounds, it's usually subtractive. But it's kind of methodical in that way, but not in a like, I know what I want, but like in a like, I'm gonna have this thing and I'm gonna alter it a little bit, and I'm going to alter it a little bit, and alter it a little bit, alter it a little bit. Yeah. Anything else? So then, after all of this shit, I'm still a brass player, and I still play brass instruments a lot. And so naturally, through this whole kind of exploration of how is sound made in the electronic domain, I couldn't simply. Basically, a lot of how brass instruments are taught they are kind of metonyms for the human voice. Like everything you're taught is sing through your instrument, play lyrically. I can't tell you the stacks of method books that I have that are like how to have a better like lyrical trombones. I mean, everything. It's all monophonic. It's all melodic, and every bit of pedagogy is. Imitate the human voice, imitate the flexibility and the grain of the human voice, and primarily the sung human voice, and primarily the bel canto style from like the 1850s of Italian sung human voice, which I find to just be completely and utterly limiting. And so naturally through this whole process, kind of over the course of like learning about, okay, this is how synthesis works, this is how CV works, CV meaning control voltage. This is how like patches are made and coding is made. Then kind of how I alluded to at the beginning of this, the kind of conceptualization of an instrumentalist as a series of modules and a big interdependent network has kind of, I felt that for a long time, but only through kind of going through this, all the coding nonsense that I continue to do. It was like, oh, that's the analog, and where it's like, yeah, to produce a tone, it's not just simply, if you put like a 440 down on a staff and give it to a trombone player, that is not just a thing. That is a whole series of interdependent things that make that thing. And so gradually, I started to become really interested in what's the feedback of that? How does this impact the actual, not just the form and the structure, but the fundamental identity of acoustic instruments? And so using a lot of parameters such as, basic things such as filtering or gating or spectral processing, but trying to do these in a in an acoustic domain. So the solo stuff that I presented last night is some of the first, not the first, but it's still, I've been doing it for a couple of years, but are results of that. So rather than thinking of, I work a lot with densities of sound and not just multiphonics, but like full spectrum type sonorities from the instrument, and like, okay, how do you shape those? It's not just this multiphonic is here because I want some noise. It's like, what are the spectral weights of this multiphonic? Can they be changed? Can they be filtered out? Can they be accentuated? Things like that. And I've been ending up with these whole, it's now up to 10 and increasing solo pieces for myself, which it stayed for myself because it is very physically demanding and required, and I get very fixated on certain techniques. I'm writing the first one for somebody else right now for solo flute, which is proving to be really interesting because I don't fundamentally understand the flute, being a brass player. But yeah, it was basically kind of, okay, if I can try to make code as porous and as malleable as an acoustic instrument, can I make an instrument as digital or analog or like kind of programmable as a computer or a synthesizer? So I'll kind of play bits from 4 of these, but it's basically, yeah, like can I treat the trombone as an acoustic synthesizer? And can I shape it in all of these ways? So thinking a lot about how do oscillators interact with each other. I found that through using preparations and special miking and everything that I could get, I mean, there's some of the stuff that I presented last night, which I'll do first, this piece called Capacity for solo trombone, that particular split tones would start to exhibit emergent behavior, like having 2 oscillators trying to frequency modulate each other, where you can slip into states of stability versus instability. And that can all happen within my lips and my airstream. And so I'll play a bit from there. But then it's shaping that as then like, oh, like what if this was a patch that I had on my synthesizer, and how would I shape that and how would I make music out of that? But trying to do that with my own body, which involves, yes, like spending lots of time with these really weird, unorthodox techniques, bizarre instrumental preparations, using different mouthpieces on these instruments, using different types of imaging and microphones and sound design, but not just using them for effects, but like this is the actual fundamental music. Because, yeah, what's up?
I just wondered if you'd mind if I shared what you asked me to do on the desk for
Yeah.
the piece.
Yeah.
Because Weston, for people who were at the concert and heard that piece, up until, so Weston performed 3 pieces. The first piece is Capacity,
Yep.
and is just amplified. But he did ask for a very specific EQ, which was boost everything beneath 100, notch out at 200, and then you can shelf by minus 12 dB, everything above 1 kilohertz, which would not be my normal EQ. So, remove all the top end boosters.
Yep.
So, some of the sound of that piece really comes from you understanding what that miking, and then this mic's right in the valve,
Yep.
so what that's going to do, what that's going to do in terms of amplification,
Yep.
the way that you hear the instrument.
Yep. Because that's one of the biggest things, is that like how I hear the instrument is fundamentally different than how everybody else hears the instrument. It's literally conducting through my jaw into my brain. And I knocked my microphone off again, sorry. And so a lot with this piece was I hear and feel a lot of these like sub-bass tones from these particular techniques, which I think the bit that I'll play is either I don't remember where this excerpt is, but it's either somewhere in here or it's just somewhere in here. And so if you were at the concert last night, there was a super, super big, long, chaotic section, and that's it. It's just so rather than a lot of the music that I grew up playing, including things like Aaron's music and these like very hyper complex, like lots of parameters existing in one, I became really interested in, can I do one thing and the sound itself has all of this dynamicism to it. So a lot of these pieces are kind of born out of that premise, because then at least for me, there's a magic to like, I'm sitting there as still as possible, really just completely inwardly focused on every micro movement of my body, and I'm not technically expending a lot of energy. I mean, it's extremely physically exhausting, but it's not an extrovert. It's this very kind of like embodied kind of thing. And So then, yeah, with the miking, with the EQing, it was then like, okay, I really feel all of these resonances of these particular sounds, and how can I get them into other people's heads in the same way that they're in my head? So this is a bit what that sounds like. No, that's... Yep. So we're basically in here. I mean, in here, sorry. So things like that, where having this particular split tone, I can just sit on this for a while, because as my lips change and as I kind of go through this whole thing, it in itself has its own generative behavior, because my biology starts to, as I'm circular breathing and blowing this interface in and out, my lips will fall into positions that they couldn't if I had started there. And so that was an interesting thing for me to highlight, and this was then having these stacks of sonorities that sound like 4, 5, or 6 trombonists playing at one time, but they're all in here, solely based on the kind of mechanics of how this system degrades over time and things like that. If we have time, I can play others, or we can open up for more questions as well. I don't know when I started. Okay. Cool. I'll just play a couple excerpts from some other ones, just so you can get an idea. So it's this thing of like, how can this thing that is supposedly so gestural and so vocal and so fluid, how can it be squared off? Can it be digital? Can it sound like 3 different things that are happening that are all through the same instrument? Another example. Both of these, this piece I just played and the one that I'm about to play, were not ones that I did last night. So. So it's basically a thing in here where then, yeah, kind of the inverse of what I was talking about earlier, where because you can process anything, because you can just simply add harmonics or do all this weight or do anything in software, like it was both a fun challenge, but also like a very rewarding thing that I've, at least just for me personally, then it's like, yeah, because I could just theoretically make a bunch of modules in Max and be able to do this with a microphone and some live electronic processing. But the magic is then kind of stripping that all away and using that language and doing all of this stuff. Kind of similar to Andy's talk of like having, like, why is the glass there? It's like because the glass has a particular you have like a particular attachment to it sonically, physically, all of these things. Like I have a very strong attachment to these instruments, and yes, I could simulate it with a synthesizer, but the kind of magic is that it's not a synthesizer, but it also kind of is. And so like these things kind of feeding back into themselves.